Welcome to the Holy Ones. I'm Todd Corey. I'm the coordinator of adult formation here at Martyred, if you don't know me already. This evening, we're going to hear about the evangelization of Japan, and specifically the story of the man called Japan's greatest preacher. Yeah, I know it's having some mic problems. The man, Paul Miki. So tonight, our presenter this evening is Walt Muscle. He's a parishioner at the nearby parish, St. Monica's, if you've ever been over there. Very beautiful parish. Father Jack Durden is the pastor over there. He's an award-winning author who writes historical fiction with Christian elements set during Japan's Christian century, an interest that he gained through the 4 years that he lived there in Japan. He's the author of multiple books, and his next novel, The Samurai Soul, will be released in February of 2026. You can connect with Walt through Instagram, YouTube, TikTok, and his website, waltmuscle.com. He has a newsletter called the Chrysanthemum, I can't say that word, and the Cross, and that's on Substack. Please join me in welcoming Walt Muscle to Martyred.
Can everybody hear me? Okay. Thank you, Todd. Thank you, Mary, our Queen, for having me. I appreciate it. Chance to talk about St. Paul Miki and His Companions. My wife and I were in Nagasaki in January of this year, and so we had the chance to visit the monument itself. It's a very moving, very heart-rending place. There's also, in addition to the monument, there's a museum, many exhibits, including relics, which you look at just understanding what they went through. There are exhibits outside. The sign you see is actually a list of everybody that was martyred in Nagasaki. There's also this one far right is a church that's across the street dedicated to the 26 martyrs. To explain what happened, we kind of have to go back to a bit about Japan's Christian century and explaining what that is. Japan's Christian century started in 1549. In 1549 August, Francis Xavier and 5 other missionaries reached Kagoshima, Japan, and came forth to try and spread the gospel. If you think of Japan's 4 main islands, think of the bottom one, the southernmost of the 4 main islands. At the tip is Kagoshima. There were 3, and including Xavier, there were 2 other missionaries who, like him, were from parts of modern-day Spain, or what is today modern-day Spain. There were also 3 Japanese missionaries, the first Japanese Christians. And so he began spreading the faith. For the next 65 years, the seeds that they planted would grow until Japan had over 300,000 Christians. They were the rule of missionary efforts in East Asia. But in 1614, the ruling government would tell the missionaries to leave. And over the next 25 to 35 years, the religion will be driven underground under penalty of death. And to understand why, we have to understand what the Jesuits found when they first got there. When Paul Miki arrived, when Francis Xavier arrived, Japan was split up into roughly 66 independent domains. There had been a civil war for 90 years, and so you had a lot of fighting, but not a lot of unity. There were also within these domains some militant Buddhist enclaves. But the latter half of the 16th century saw Japan united by 3 men. These are the men up here. The first one is Oda Nobunaga. He comes in 1551 when his father passes away at a young age. He shows up the same year that Xavier actually left. Xavier spent 2 years in Japan and then went back to India. Nobunaga, over the next 31 years, would go from ruling half of a province to ruling half the provinces in Japan. But it was bloody, it was brutal, and he decimated many of his enemies, including in some cases women and children. He also did the same thing to some of these Buddhist areas. In 1582, Nobunaga was assassinated. And when I say assassinated, this means one of his generals turned traitor, surrounded the temple he was in, and he took his own life. There was basically a power vacuum, power struggle for a year to 2 years, and then the guy in the middle, Toyotomi Hideyoshi, came to power. Because of his predecessor's brutality, Hideyoshi began working more towards treaties and ways of getting people to join him in an effort to unify Japan. He would have to have 3 main battles. Once he became the leading replacement for Oda Nobunaga, he would have 3 main battles to finish unifying Japan. But overall, it relatively worked, and then in 1590, he had essentially unified the country. However, for all 3 of these men, the one thing they wanted most was to pass it on. And Hideyoshi had not had a succession plan well in place because he didn't have much luck with having children. And in 1598, he passed away. He died. Another power struggle for 2 years. The final guy, Tokugawa Ieyasu, comes to power, and he is the one who establishes the dynasty that would eventually kick out the missionaries in 1614, and they would rule Japan for the next 250 plus years. Anybody watch Shogun, the recent Shogun? Okay. This is the main Japanese warlord. This Tokugawa Ieyasu is the guy it's based on. I'm going to get a little bit to Paul Miki. And you got to understand that the persecution didn't start with the Ieyasu, the guy on the end. It was going on all the time, and the church was growing. In fact, Paul Miki's time was under the guy in the middle, Toyotomi Hideyoshi. But let's talk a little bit about Paul Miki. Paul Miki may have been born in Awa province, and that's the red area you see on the map, or he may have been born across the strait on the main island in either Setsu or Harima. We say 1562 or 1564 because births weren't really recorded for most of the populace. One, when you were born, you were already considered 1 year old. So you got time for gestation. And then when the lunar new year hit, you became the next year old. So if you were born like a month before the lunar new year started, a month later you're 2 years old, by the way they count ages. And also, because the lunar calendar doesn't quite align with the calendar we're currently used to, we're not quite sure of the year. His father, Miki was a Christian samurai, very devoted, possibly a warlord, and he converted the family. They were well off, we know that. He also attended the Jesuit school, we believe, beginning around the age of 10 or 12 in the central part of Japan. As he gets a little older, he attended Jesuit seminaries, first in Azuchi, which is a little northeast of Kyoto, and then he goes down to Nagasaki, which is halfway between Kyoto and Osaka. He became an iguman, which is the Japanese variation of what was called then an irmão, if I'm pronouncing that correctly from Portuguese, or brother. He would support, once he joined the Jesuits, he supported the provincial that was in the southern island of Kyushu, around the islands across from that red spot on the map, and he would later move to central Japan to support the church there. His father died in battle in Bungo province in 1587, in one of the battles I mentioned about Hideyoshi earlier, and the area in red is Bungo where his father passed. A few things about him. One, he was short by Japanese standards. He also was very hardworking, very logical, well thought of. But for someone studying to be a priest, he had one thing that he really didn't like. Can anybody guess? And I've got a free book for anybody gets the right answer. Any guesses? For somebody studying to be a priest, what might be the one thing not liking can be a problem? Latin. That's it. He did not like Latin and wasn't very good at it. You want red, green, or yellow, green, or blue? Take the blue. There you go. But we get back to the martyrs themselves, the whole group, all group 26. When you look at this monument, can everybody see it very well? What's the first thing you notice about that monument that kind of stands out? I know what it is for me.
Cross.
The cross, that's one thing. Look at the children, yes. There are 3 kids among these 26. They were ages 12, 13, and then one was either 14 or 15. They were altar boys at a Franciscan church in Kyoto called Our Lady of Angels, though one may have worked in Osaka as well. Or one may have worked in Osaka, not as well, just worked in Osaka. But this is what we know about them. 23 adults, 3 children. 9 clerics. The remaining martyrs were mostly secular Franciscans. And when I say secular Franciscans, if you remember St. Francis of Assisi, he had his Friars Minor, he had his Poor Ladies of Sister Clare, and then he had a 3rd order for married people. And that grew into like some people who weren't fully devoted, but serving the church the best they could. And I don't want to demean everyone, but a 3rd order. And so that's what these people were, who were dedicating their time and their talents to the church to help it grow. Doctor, pharmacist, carpenter, cook, you name it, they had it. And so that's what these other missionaries were, plus the 3 boys. Of the 9 clerics, 3 Jesuits, all Japanese. Paul Miki and 2 others who were not Jesuit when this all started. And 6 Franciscans, all non-Japanese. 4 from Spain, 1 was from India, and 1 was from Mexico. And there were also a father-son combination, as well, and brothers with their nephew, and 2 brothers with a nephew. But when we look at this happen, the question we get to is why? When people study the martyrs, St. Paul, Miki and His Companions, they're all, why did this have to happen? What happened makes no sense. And for that, I'm going to have to go back to Japanese history just a little bit, starting in 1587. In 1587, as I said earlier, there were 3 areas where Hideyoshi, the guy in the middle of those 3 men, had to basically go to battle and subdue Japan. And so at the bottom there, what happened was Hideyoshi was invited to come south because the clan in the reddish area, or the pinkish area, the Shimazu clan, invaded one of the Christian warlords that they neighbored. So they invited Hideyoshi in to help. He came in with overwhelming force and then took them out. And as he defeated them. But essentially his plan was to defeat them and then leave them in place, which is how he operated. After the battle was over, they had a celebration. And then the next day, the Jesuits are hearing banging on the doors, and they're being told to leave the country. They don't know what had happened, but that basically, it was called the Hakata Edict. Hideyoshi put these documents out that said, 1, Japan is the land of the gods and the Buddha. 2, you are destroying Buddhist monuments. You shouldn't be doing that. 3, you're focusing on the Christian warlords, which you should not be focusing on. You should focus on the people, because if the warlord converts, the people under him are likely to convert as well. And because that's the way they respect the hierarchical society, that's the way that worked. They were also allowing slavery, the sale of Japanese slaves. This wasn't the Jesuits. This was the Portuguese traders who were going shipping back and forth between Japan and the rest of Asia. At the time, in this time period, China had a prohibition on trading with Japan because of Japanese piracy. And so the Portuguese stepped in as middlemen and began facilitating trade. That's why they're there. And so part of the piracy included Japanese slaves. And the Jesuits did try to put a stop to it, but they weren't successful. Finally they could start excommunicating with about a decade later, and that ended up putting down quite a bunch. Hideyoshi destroyed, of the 250 Christian locations, Hideyoshi destroyed over 60 of them, including all the churches in the main area of Kyoto, Osaka, and then below was Sakai, which is the Osaka suburb today. The Jesuits they forced the Jesuits to downplay what they were doing. And by downplaying, they were saying, just take it, don't be so out there, don't be so ostentatious, just be discreet, you can stay. Only 3 people left. Hideyoshi knew they were there, and a few years later he was seen walking through the streets of Kyoto carrying a rosary because he thought it was a cool decoration. But officially, only 2 people had the right to be in Japan who were missionaries. The first is the guy at the top who we have no pictures of. His name is Jean Rodriguez. He was one of the 2 best language speakers in the Jesuits. He would officially later become Hideyoshi's official interpreter, and later after that, Tokugawa Ieyasu's official interpreter, helping them with trade. He was allowed to be in the country. The other one, you see the guy below, Alessandro Valagnano. Alessandro Valagnano is the father visitor of the Jesuits. And basically, you take the Jesuit general, he's got one person basically he can send as a special envoy, and so that's who went to Japan, he's in charge. He comes in as an ambassador, not as a missionary, and therefore he is allowed to be there. And it's on this ambassador tag that the Franciscans finally get into Japan. A bunch of church politics. Basically, for the longest time, Japan was actually controlled out of Macau, which is out in China. And so basically the Jesuits were allowed to keep a monopoly on what they were doing in Japan. But once Japan became its own diocese, then Rome started allowing others. The Franciscans were first, but they came as ambassadors. Hideyoshi had sent notes out to a couple of countries saying, bow down to me. One country sent him a really funny reply. That was China. And the Philippines said, how about if we just trade with you? And he said, okay, I like that. And so they set up an embassy of some sorts using Franciscans coming in. And so the Franciscans thought, oh, they're welcomed by Hideyoshi. And so they come into Kyoto. They build this beautiful church. See right here is a picture of it. It's called Our Lady of the Angels. One side of the church is a hospital. Both sides of the church have hospitals. One's called St. Anne's, and I think the other one is St. Joseph's or St. John's. They basically are there to treat lepers, the poor, those who don't have medical care. And that's why they had a doctor and a pharmacist among their tertiaries that could teach and help there. They had other Franciscans come in. They established presences in Osaka, and then down south in Nagasaki. And now we get to what happened with the incident that brought about Sir Miki and His Companions. It starts with a ship called the San Felipe. This is probably one of the few, when we talk about this incident, this is probably one of the few things everybody agrees on. The Jesuits and the Franciscans had a rivalry which was unhealthy at times. It's unfortunate, but it's true. And so they both have competing stories about what actually went down in this event. And then as for the Japanese, Christianity was, for most of them, still a minor thing, because it only occupied 2% of the country at best. And so they didn't think of it as this huge thing that they needed to monitor. They monitored it a little bit, but that's the same way they monitor anything else in politics. And so you might have diary entries on this, but not a lot was written about it officially. But the San Felipe, and this is a model from the museum, was sailing from Manila to Acapulco. It's an old ship, 800 to 1,000 tons, and it left in July 12th. It left July 12th, which was late in this season. Basically, you had to leave at a certain time for the winds and for the currents. You could be stuck out in the ocean if you did wrong. You could also get hit by typhoons, as they did. When you think of going to Japan, you have to look at the way the Trans-Pacific crossings were done. You start this way, you can go, if you're going from Manila to Acapulco, which was the standard route for the Spanish, because the Spanish controlled this part of the world. You go from Manila, as far as trade, as far as, if you may have heard about these treaties, Portugal and Spain divided the world between themselves. This was the Spanish half. So Manila going to Acapulco, you take a northeastern route that would take you close to Japan, go across, and then go down. If you're going west, you take a more direct route to go back. And there were a number of times when ships got damaged at sea. And they put into port in Japan, got repairs, and then went on. It was not an uncommon thing. But in this case, the San Felipe was overloaded, and this was common as well. When they had the last ship of the season, they would overload everything to get on it, and they put over 1 million pesos worth of silk and silver on the ship. It also carried 4 Augustinians, 1 Dominican, and 2 Franciscans. A guy named Juan Pobre, who was a chronicler and who is responsible for a lot of the information that we have. And then we have Felipe de Jesus, who would actually become one of the martyrs. The ship wrecked off Barado, which is, if you remember Kyushu, remember the island where Paul Miki was born? On the bottom, on the southern part of it, you've got Barado, and that's where the ship landed. When the ship got there, the issue that you had is you had the cargo spilling out. They had shipwrecked coming in. It was spilling out, creating a stretch of colored silk for miles. It was very attractive. And so they brought all the cargo ashore. And the Spaniards hoped to build a new ship to return themselves and the cargo to the Philippines. But what actually happened is when they saw the cargo, the Japanese local governor, Tosakabe Motochika, the guy on the left, made plans to steal it. From there, he basically said, okay, you can ask for the new ship. We're going to send you, I've got a house in Osaka. I'll send you there with a delegate, one of my delegates, your delegation will make the arrangements. And I want you to work with this guy over here, Manchita Nagamoni, who's on the right side. And he said, work with him, and he'll help out and get it done. But Manchita Nagamoni Hideyoshi had a group called the 5 Commissioners, or the Gobugyo, that were in charge of everything administratively in Kyoto and all the surrounding areas. And so the guy on the left, Chosakabe, sent him to the guy on the right, Manchita Nagamori. And so basically made him wait. They came, he said, okay, wait here in Osaka. They went to Kyoto, said, I'll make the arrangement, I'll set you up a meeting with Hideyoshi. And then he comes back, oh, everything's great. Then they take him all the way to Kyoto, to Hideyoshi, and all of a sudden they find out Hideyoshi is really mad. Why? Because the captain of the ship, a guy named Landicho, has made the request, but he's not with the delegation. So this was seen as improper. He said, okay, go back, wait it out. But this was pretty much all a ruse. When Chosakabe's rep had gone first to Kyoto, he delivered a complete cargo manifest of what was going on and said, let's take it. And so Mashita takes the manifest and starts going all the way back to the shipwreck site and says, okay, we'll take care of it. Unfortunately for Mashita, or unfortunately or whatever, he encountered a guy named Konishi Yukinaga on the route. Konishi Yukinaga is was probably the largest Christian warlord in all of Japan. And so he got word of this, and he started making inquiries as well. So why come to San Felipe? 3 reasons. Well, one, the biggest is greed. But you also had Kyoto being devastated by an earthquake in 1595. They needed money to rebuild. Hideyoshi, once he had conquered Japan, also wanted to take Korea next and eventually China. They launched a very expensive invasion of Korea. The treasury was dry. This was there for the taking. And so that's why they went there. The Franciscans and the Spanish figured this out, and so they decided to say, let's try another way. So what they went to a guy named Hideyoshi. Hideyoshi was also in that group of 5 that ran things for Hideyoshi. But he's a little different. He's the guy that the Christians normally went to meet with Hideyoshi. He's a Buddhist priest, but he has 2 Christian sons. He's extremely friendly to the Christian religion. It's one of the things that made him work out that way. And when they showed up at his door, his reaction was the exact same as anybody else might have. Guys, why didn't you come to me first? He says, I'll see what I can do. I'll reach out to Hideyoshi, but I have no promises. So he's trying that. At the same time, back in where the cargo is being held, Captain Lanticho asked Mashita if he can appeal directly to Hideyoshi because they figured out what's going on. And Mashita said, yeah, once I finish loading all the cargo up, we'll take it to Kyoto. You can make your appeal at that time to get it back. A very sarcastic type of answer. At some point, Mashita looks at the pilot of the ship, a guy named Francisco de Landio, and says, so how did Spain get so big anyway? And Deolandi, the pilot, whether thinking it was a joke or just really ticked off, he goes, Spain dominates globally by sending in the priests first. This was the exact wrong thing to say. Now, this comment is not responsible for what happened. Not completely responsible. There was a lot going on here. You had Hideyoshi's personal physician, a guy named Jacqueline, was violent against Christians and was always poisoning Hideyoshi's ear. And this was another example, another chance. But somebody on their side had said it. The priests come first, and that's how we expand. This was a common belief or a common thought within Japan since 1570, and now someone from the Japanese perspective had said the quiet part out loud. This made Hideyoshi angry, and he said, we're going to kill all the missionaries, execute all the missionaries in the area. Negotiations started, and another way that came out, you see, I said earlier that basically Japan became its own diocese. It finally got its own bishop in August of 1596. His name was Bishop Martin. My Spanish isn't that good. Bishop Martins. I've also seen some places it's Martinez or Martin. I'm not sure how it's pronounced. But he left Nagasaki to go to Osaka and eventually Kyoto to present his ambassador credentials. He ran into that Christian warlord, Konishi Kinagi en route, found out what happened, and so he's sitting in front of Hideyoshi, November 26th, making an appeal to give him back the cargo to let everything go. Unfortunately, it's too late by that time, and nothing's going to happen. They continue talking about it, and eventually Chosokabe and Mashita meet with Hideyoshi on December 8th, and on that day, Hideyoshi orders that the Christians be imprisoned. And so what it comes down to when we get to how this group of martyrs got put together, it was who was who was at home at the time. You look at the Kyoto church, you have four of the Franciscan missionaries who were always in Kyoto, plus Felipe de Jesus. You have some of the tertiaries who are working with the church, they went after them. You see the top 5 with the asterisk next to the name. These guys were sent to jail immediately. Everybody else was placed under house arrest. They also surrounded the Kyoto Jesuit house, the Osaka Jesuit house, and the Osaka Franciscan house. Eventually they would release the Jesuit house, and this created a lot of animosity. Why did the Jesuit house get released? It was Hideyoshi realizing that he still needed the Portuguese and he still needed the Jesuits for trade. And it was letting them go to sort of just let things, at least for that, not completely shut off the trade. Only 3 guys of those houses got out. The first was the guy at the top, who was the house owner, who was a rich, high-ranking Japanese individual, and they were not going to touch him. But you also had 2 Jesuit missionaries in the Jesuit house. They were hiding inside the house. The guards who were surrounding them didn't know they were there. These 2 Christian samurai, John Akashi's at the bottom and Thomas Ukita, showed up at the house, took their entourage inside, changed clothes, and snuck them out. If they had been found out, they would have all been killed. But they got them out successfully and left everyone else in where they were. We don't know much else than roughly Christmas of 1596, Christmas of that year. We know that in the Kyoto church, they were allowed to celebrate midnight mass. The people weren't allowed inside, so the parishioners celebrated from outside, singing carols with them. We know in the Osaka house that they were allowed to have visitors and allowed to celebrate mass by their guards. And so the local Osaka parishioners came in, including one of the Franciscan missionaries who had not been home at the time. And so he took confession while he was there, and they celebrated midnight mass. And then the Spanish, who were still stuck in that house in Osaka, because they basically said, "You're our guest," which meant they were in prison, even though it was the rich guy's house. They were let out to go have mass, but their calendar was one day off. So they repeated the whole Christmas thing all over again. And then in the Osaka house, it's not known what Paul Miki did at Christmas, but they do know they were allowed guests, and then he eventually baptized 6 people. Paul Miki was quoted as saying, "I was greatly consoled to see how they received baptism, with such an understanding of the things of our faith, and with such desires for salvation." After Christmas, things sort of moved very quickly. On December 31st, the prisoners in Osaka were ordered to Kyoto to be processed. And they were going to be processed by the guy on the right, Hideyoshi. This is the 3rd member of Hideyoshi's group of 5. He is neither friendly nor unfriendly to Christians. He doesn't hate. He thinks that they're okay. He's not like the Mayadagini, like a supporter, but he has nothing against them either. What he really doesn't want is, these are prisoners coming from Osaka. Osaka should deal with it. I don't want to deal with it. But he was ordered to until he brought them in. The Franciscan house prisoners arrived from Osaka on January 1st. And Ishida, because he didn't want to do it, made him wait outside. Osaka's very cold at this time of year. Not that the prison was much warmer, but he made him wait outside. January 2nd in the morning, the soldiers went to the Kyoto church, and they got the five missionaries. They also took all the tertiaries who were still there and took them to the prison as well. And then in January 2nd, the afternoon, the Jesuit house prisoners from Osaka, Paul Miki and the 2 others who were studying to be Jesuits, arrived in Kyoto. So they were all put together. The first time they were all together at any time. Paul Miki did something when he went into prison that is debated even today. He walked over to the Franciscans and said, "Thank you. Because of your work, I'm probably paraphrasing, your work, we are receiving God's grace." He knew by being Japanese that they had been a little in your face to Hideyoshi. They'd gone over what Hideyoshi wanted to be downplayed. But he was also impressed by what they had done. Impressed by how they had built what they had. And he said, "It's because of your work that we are receiving the grace of being allowed to die for Christ." When the prison all together, it was a public jail, and so Paul Miki, as he would do for the rest of the trip, began preaching to everyone in the jail. And because he was loud enough, the people outside could hear him as well, including the guards. The one thing we have from Paul Miki, who came on January 1st or December 31st, he said, "I am 33 years old, the same age in which our Lord suffered. Today is the feast of Jesus, to whose society I, although unworthy, belong. Today is Wednesday, and they say we'll be sentenced on Friday. Although unworthy, I greatly wish to imitate a little my Lord Jesus Christ, who suffered so much for me." And so it begins. They took, on January 3rd, they took the prisoners out, and they took them down to southern Kyoto, in the area of Fushimi, which is near the castle that Hideyoshi had. Originally, Hideyoshi had ordered that they cut off their nose and both their ears as Captain Landicho of the Spanish ship made an appeal to Mitsunari, the guy in charge of the overseeing what was going on. And he said, can you just make it a little kinder? So they cut off their left earlobes, and that was it. But it was still bloody. They put them in cages, 3-door cage, Franciscans on the front with the Jesuits in the back, and they paraded them around Kyoto. He would throw things at them, jeer at them. The writings will say that they were called animals. That was not quite accurate. They were likely being called the Japanese word baka, which means idiot. But in Portuguese and Spanish back then, had an animal connotation. I think in Spanish today it means cow, I'm not sure. But something had an animal connotation that was used. Then, after they did this in Kyoto, and they had supporters who tried to get to them, the guards wouldn't let them. They went down to Osaka on January 4th, and then down to Sakai on January 5th. You'll notice the pictures I have. Sakai is just a little south of Osaka. I lived there for 2 years. You notice the pictures I have. The first one on the left, January 4th, that is the grave of Hosokawa Gracia. She is the most famous Japanese Christian female, or famous Christian female in Japanese history. For the Shogun fans, yes, she is the basis for the heroine. She became a Christian in 1587 after Hideyoshi told the missionaries to leave. Why? She had some very close friends who were Christian. She did it to support them. Eventually, she became well known as one of the most devout Christians there was, and she was eventually killed in 1600 as part of the power struggle which brought the last guy to power. That grave, you see the larger grave with her, the larger monument, that's hers. The five smaller ones around it are for the 5 servants she died with that tried to protect her. On the right side, you see what's called Xavier Park. It's in Sakai. Francis Xavier was there in sometime 1550, 1551. But you see all the buildings in the back? Everybody see the buildings in the back? When Xavier's standing there, that is all shore. That's basically, it's been built up since then. So that park was basically the edge of the beach when he was there. And if you're standing in that spot, you would see Xavier was seeing the coast. So these men, Hideyoshi put out an official placard, and this placard would be carried in front of the Hideyoshi, in front of the martyrs for their entire trip. It says, these men have come from the Philippines with the title of ambassadors and remained in Kyoto preaching the Christian religion, which I previously prohibited in past years. I thus command they be executed along with the Japanese who have joined their religion. And so these 24 will be crucified in Nagasaki. Let all know that I again prohibit from now on the said religion. If anyone dares to disobey this order, he will be punished together with his family. The first thing you notice, 24. There were only 24 prisoners. They would get 26. Two of the people who went with them, tried to support them on their trip, all the way to Nagasaki, ended up joining them as part of the martyrs. And we'll talk about that later when it happened. The most interesting thing is this. Let all know that I again prohibit from now on this said religion. And this kind of gives you a little bit of Hideyoshi's perspective. Hideyoshi prohibited the religion in 1587, but then again he's prohibiting it now. What he really wanted to do was to get them to downplay their efforts again. To Hideyoshi, to us, it's 26 people being martyred for the faith. For Hideyoshi, it's basically giving the Christians a bloody nose. That's it. He didn't think of it as anything further than that. But that's what he was trying to do. So they go from there, they spend several days in a Buddhist temple in Sakai, and then they go back up to Osaka. And then on the 10th they began their journey. You see up here, on the 11th they reached, you see them every day, they're doing about 30 kilometers each day. Sometimes walking, sometimes on horseback. And what you see here is they had the placard in front. They'd have 200 plus samurai around them, and they'd have somebody who's in charge that would go with them for several days and then turn it over to somebody else. The first 2 days, January 11th, they hit Akashi. And Akashi was where this guy is, Takayama Ukon. Takayama Ukon is the most famous Christian samurai in Japanese history. He was the warlord at the time. At one time, in 1586, he was the warlord of that area. But what happened? In 1587, when Hideyoshi said, tell the Christians to get out, he also told this guy, either give up your faith, or I'm taking away your domain. Takayama Ukon said, you can have it. And so he gave it up to them, and he went back to basically being a little bit lower, starting to move up. He was a brilliant administrator. He would eventually be exiled and was martyred in the Philippines in February 3rd, 1615. That is also his feast day. January 12th, they reached Himeji. Why is Himeji important? Not quite yet, but what you see is a tile. Himeji has the most famous castle in all of Japan. If you've ever seen the pictures of a Japanese castle that's 6 stories and it looks like a white bird or white heron, if you've ever seen the movie You Only Live Twice, James Bond, or else The Old Shogun, that's Himeji Castle. It was designed to be impregnable and it was never tested, but it is the most famous example of Japanese castle architecture. When they started driving Christianity out of the country, they basically destroyed anything that looked remotely Christian. Did you see, anybody watch Silence? At the end of Silence, there's a scene where the 2 priests are looking at cargo that's come in for trade, and they're trying to get rid of anything that is remotely Christian. And the Japanese did their best to eliminate all this. But for some reason, on Japanese castles, they have these on the talisman that are protecting against typhoons, against floods, against fire. Himeji Castle has a cross, and for some reason it was allowed to stay there. In spite of the ban, in spite of everything, it's still there today. If you go there, there's a sign that says, we don't know how it got here, we don't know how it lasted, but it's here. The internet has some good conspiracy theories, but that's what they did. We go next. And when they took over, they were taken over by a guy next. They were taken by a guy named John Akashi. John Akashi was one of the 2 samurai who snuck in to the Osaka Jesuit house and snuck out one of the priests. He'd been a Christian for about a year, very devoted to his faith, and he was doing anything he could. In fact, he would control them for the next basically oversee them for the next 4 days. And they considered at this point, it probably one of the best parts of the trip. They know they're marching to their death, but at least the person in charge is being nice to them, treating them well, and taking care of them as best as he can. And so he controlled them for about 4 days, so January 13th when he picked them up. And then you've got January 15th. This is a rather interesting love story. The guy on the left, he is Ukita Hideye. He is the clan of the Ukita clan. You have on his right Dohime. That is his wife. She is Hideyoshi's adopted daughter. The Ukita clan and their area were very friendly to Christians. They weren't Christians themselves, but they had no problem with it. They welcomed Christianity with open arms. And eventually, Ukita would come on the wrong side of the battle in 1600 in that last fight for power and would get exiled. And so basically, he separated from his wife and kids for the rest of his life. His wife and kids, and he became Catholic because they believed in what they would be together again when they died. They stayed faithful to each other the entire time. Paul Miki talks about this one time. He said, we were handed over to the care of Akashi Kamon, and his name was John Akashi. Kamon's a title. That was sometimes how you referred to people. When he first saw me, he took my hand and wept. I can't say how many tears. He is firm and constant in his intention not to show any weakness in his Christian faith, and that is all that need be said. He says that he wishes Taiko would make inquiries about him so that he can join our party. It gives me great consolation to see how well he declares the constancy of his faith. The reference to Taiko is a reference to Hideyoshi. It was his title. It means retired regent. The Taiko, Sama Taiko, they call him a lot of things, but Taiko was his official title. Unfortunately, after this, during this time, the martyrs have been allowed to write letters. And so Akashi took whatever letters they got and took care of delivering them. But from now on, they were having an issue where they were under less friendly leadership. We're not sure where they stayed the 16th, 17th, and 18th. But the 19th, they reached a place called Mihara, and they were allowed to rest a little bit. And in Mihara, one of the boys, Thomas Nagasaki, wrote a letter to his mom, exhorting her to be faithful and to take care of his two brothers. The letter was eventually found in his father's clothes after they were crucified, covered in blood. There is an exhibit. This picture's from there, from the outside the museum. It shows a little shrine to Thomas Nagasaki and the letter he wrote with both the original Japanese and an English translation. The reason we don't know a lot about this, again, is because once you got out of the friendly areas, there wasn't a big deal to write this by the Japanese. So we only know they got to Mihara for the letter. That's how we know. A few other things. Going further, they get all the way down to Shimonoseki, which is at the tip of the main island. And this, we have no idea where they went in these few days. We can guess. They most likely were following one of the main roads of Japan. I think it's called the Mountain Sun Road, or they call it Sanjo. But it was a road that went along the coast, up in the mountains, come back down, and it was a well-traveled road. It's thought maybe they went through here, but we have no record because they were in it basically what was unfriendly territory for the Christians. So they get all the way down to Shimonoseki, and then they would have to cross over. The one thing we do know is this is where the final two guys were at it. And that Peachtree, who originally was sent with them to minister them, and was the next guy planning to carry letters home, was added to them, along with Francis, who was their carpenter, who had helped the Franciscans build the church in Kyoto, and also what they did in Osaka. From there, they crossed over into Kyushu, the southern island. So now they're on the island where Nagasaki is located. They would get all the way to Hakata, which is on January 31st, and that would be the first time again, since from earlier from Akashi, where they would have the chance to talk to Christians. A lot of what was going on, they were trying to be coy about it because they didn't want to riot. The person in charge did not want to riot. The reason we know about it is because of something else. The guards, the original guys from the Spanish ship, who had been supposedly guests at the warlord's house in Osaka, were let go about a week after they left. And they jumped on a boat and wanted to sail. They wanted to find them. And so they started sailing, trying to catch up with them. You know, they were in Shimonoseki on 126th, I think? Yes. They got to Shimonoseki 3 days later. They were always a step or two behind them. And so we have from their records in trying to chase them down where they went. But this is one of the areas that we know, Hakata. And once they were in Hakata, this is what happened. Like I said, first chance to talk to Christians. Paul Miki ran into a friend of his. The additional letters they had given, the ones that Skijiro was supposed to carry, they gave it to the friend, and the friend said he would deliver them. Paul Miki continued to preach. And what's also interesting is that the executioner in charge of the actual act in Nagasaki was contacted. Now his name was Terazawa Hanzamuro. Hanzamuro, if you see it where it says February 1st, 2-1, that's called Mikatsu. And you see a little dot above that with no date. That place is called Nagoya. Now, if you've ever heard anything about Japan, you know there's a large city, Nagoya, in central Japan. But there was another city called Nagoya, had a castle. It was on Kyushu. And that's where Hanzawa was waiting. He was going to take charge of them. But he had a couple of surprises. When he finally made up to them. One, he found out there were 26 prisoners, not 24. Which his orders said, you're executing 24. And he also found there were kids. And he was going to follow Hideyoshi's orders. But he did not. He definitely did not want to execute kids. So he looked at the youngest and said, I have the ability to release you. I will take care of you. However, you cannot be a Christian. He told him to go ask the friar what he thought. The kid looked him in the eye and said, I don't need to ask. It's a no. The other surprise he got was he discovered Hanzawa had attended those same Jesuit schools that Paul Miki did growing up. And so he found his old friend Paul Miki. He had been known him as a child, but we think he had also attended catechism classes when Paul Miki was studying to be a Jesuit. And he did not want to kill his old friend. Paul Miki told him there was no shame in dying for Christ. But he made 3 requests. One, can you postpone the execution until Friday, February 7th? And he said, can you allow the prisoners to make confession? And can you allow us to celebrate Mass? And that was how it was left. They don't see Hanzawa again after this until closer to the end. The prisoners made it without Hanzawa. They go all the way down to a place called Stoligi, which is right. If you see it across, you see a little dotted line on the map. They're crossing up. They're having to cross the harbor. Where they are in Stoligi, they are greeted by 2 Jesuits, Rodriguez, the translator, and another guy named Francisco Passio. Rodriguez and Passio brought the items to help them celebrate Mass. And Hanzawa's guard said, we don't have an official approval, you're not going to do it. So Passio has to leave to try to go back to Hanzawa and get an official approval. However, Rodriguez, he is Hideyoshi's interpreter. They're not going to tell him, no, you can't go talk to these people. Even though they were okay with telling Passio that. So Rodriguez and Paul Miki discussed the journey, and they picked up a bit and learned the state of Osaka and what was going on. The 2 Jesuits, John Milto and James Kisai, were told, you're going to be allowed to say your final vows. We've made an arrangement. And then Paul Miki, basically, Rodriguez talked with Friar Pedro Bautista. Bautista was the superior. He was in charge of the Franciscan mission for all of Japan. And one of the things he did to Rodriguez was confirm the zeal of Paul Miki. How much he had been preaching, how much he had been faithful to basically keeping them exhorted and keeping their spirits up. And then Rodriguez and Bautista exchanged what is still being, another thing that's being talked about and thought of as odd. They exchanged apologies. As I mentioned before, there was a rivalry, an unhealthy rivalry between the Franciscans and the Jesuits. And so the Franciscans were saying, maybe we shouldn't have been so big, so grand in what we did in the capital right in front of them. And the Jesuits saying, we probably should have treated you better. We weren't exactly the nicest people to you. And I'm paraphrasing what was actually said. But there was a recognition of what happened, and that both groups, were at fault. Partially at fault for what was going on. And so they granted each other mutual absolution on behalf of the 2 orders. From there, they basically wrote their final letters, and then got on boats and crossed a small channel. I said they wrote the final letters, took boats across the harbor. They were forced to spend the night in the cold on the boats. As for their soldiers, there was an inn. They were basically where they had arrived. There was an inn right in front of them, the only inn in the area. Some of the friends of the Spanish captain were there, hoping to catch him. The guards came in, kicked all the Spanish friends out of the inn, and took it over. Wouldn't let them near him. So on the final day, they took that last walk to the area of Nagasaki Hill where they were to be martyred. They ran into Rodriguez again, and they learned that he had said, that Hanzabo had said no, he wasn't going to allow Mass, he wasn't going to allow confession. The problem was, he also wasn't going to allow them to enter Nagasaki, again because he feared a riot. He did allow the two Jesuit people who were studying, taking their vows, to go into the local Jesuit hospital that they would pass by. It's called St. Lazarus. And they were allowed to say their final vows. And so the three Jesuits, Paul Miki and the two others, did get to say confession to Rodriguez. And then they all heard one final sermon. They did get one thing approved. The original choice had been the site where everybody who's a criminal in Nagasaki gets executed. They're saying they're not criminals, they're martyrs. Can we give them a different site? So they chose a different site and they allowed it. It wasn't very far from the criminal site, but it was a nice bit of land because there was a plan to build a church on there one day as a monument to the martyrs. And that's where that church is. They did request that two extra people be freed. They lost that one. They requested Casio and Rodriguez be allowed to minister to the prisoners. That was allowed. And then they had the crucifixion. Now, a Japanese crucifixion is very different from the Roman crucifixion, which in the Roman, where you tied up, it's asphyxiation plus a number of other things. In the case of a Japanese crucifixion, your hands are latched out, your feet are on a lower bar. There's also even a slight little chair, a bar chair, that's in the middle that you're sitting on. They tie you to the cross, and they make you as tight as they possibly can. The reason is the way the crucifixion is handled is they don't wait you out. They just get you tied to where you can't move. They take two lances on this side, one on each hip, and they basically create an X inside your body. It's relatively quick. So that's why if you ever see someone from the martyrs from this area, you will see them with what looks to be spears coming out of their back. That's how they were killed. Now they had braces. The way they did it, they tried to measure the crosses in advance. They had braces on their necks, braces on their arms, braces on their feet. And when they put everybody, Paul Miki had a problem because he was really short, and so his feet were dangling, and he couldn't reach the bottom bar. So they gave an extra sash and tied him tighter to the cross. When they put them all up in the holes, the first thing they noticed was Felipe de Jesus, the one from Mexico, was choking. It was not set, it was not the right height for him. And so Hanzabo pointed to him, told two executioners, and they martyred Felipe de Jesus first. And then they went to each end. They had two executioners, two lances, and they went to the crosses from the outside and started moving in, with Tasio and Rodriguez offering prayers as they did. The last person was Pedro Bautista, the head of the Franciscan, and his last words were, "Into your hands I deliver my spirit." But they remember what Paul Miki said as well from the cross. And this is he said many things. But the sentence of judgment says these men came to Japan from the Philippines, but I did not come from any other country. I am a true Japanese. The only reason for my being killed is that I have taught the doctrine of Christ. I certainly did teach the doctrine of Christ. I thank God it's for this reason that I die. I believe that I'm telling only the truth before I die.
I know you believe me, and I want to say to you all once again, ask Christ to help you to become happy. I obey Christ. After Christ's example, I forgive my persecutors. I do not hate them. I ask God to have pity on all, and out of my blood will follow my fellow men as a fruitful rain. Bishop Martins didn't really get a chance to know Paul Miki, but he was in the crowd watching this. And in listening to Paul Miki preach, he would later be quoted as saying Paul Miki was the greatest preacher in all of Japan. The feast day is celebrated on February 6th. They were martyred on February 5th, but I believe February 5th belongs to St. Agatha. So the church moved it to February 6th. Beatified September 14, 1627 by Pope Urban VIII. Canonized June 8, 1862 by Pope Pius IX. The canonization is particularly interesting because Japan had been closed for 250 years. And so in the 1850s is when the Americans and the Russians began trying to open Japan. The Americans succeeded, and Christians started trying to bring Christianity in again. So the canonization coincides with an opening trying to bring Christianity back to Japan. When you study the martyrs, you get moved by many stories. One of the people I think about is Gautama Garcia. He was the friar from India. He'd originally been a Jesuit in Japan. His father was Portuguese, his mother was Indian. Portugal had a huge colony in Goa, India, which was headquarters of Portuguese trade efforts and the Catholic Church in East Asia. And so he had originally tried to be a Jesuit. He'd gone to Japan. It didn't work out very well. He left society, went to Macau, became a merchant, eventually went to Manila. And in Manila, he discovered the Franciscan convent, and he dedicated his life again. And when the Franciscans had the chance to become ambassadors, the one thing that psyched them the most was they had a guy in their membership who already spoke the language, who was already familiar with the culture, and he could help them all learn when they got there. You had St. Anthony, the 13-year-old, who, if a lot of stuff is rhetorical. We don't know everything is true, but his mother had made the trip and was crying at the bottom of his cross. And he sang a song to try to calm away his mother's tears. A lot of people just really moving what they went through. Another one, Matthias. All we know about him is his name. When the guards looked for tertiaries, they said, we're looking for a guy named Matthias. Matthias, and this guy says, I'm Matthias. His name was Matthias, but he wasn't the right one. There was more than one Matthias. And the arrest order had a different person listed. Matthias, they said, greater love hath no man. That he claimed to be the right Matthias, and he took it for his friend. My favorite, though, is Felipe de Jesus. Felipe de Jesus was the guy from Mexico. He's today the patron saint of Mexico City. His parents were from Spain. They were married in Seville in 1570. They moved to New Spain, which is what Mexico was called back then, 1571. And Felipe was born in 1572. Possibly was a silversmith, later entered a friar in Mexico City, but left. It just wasn't for him. At the age of 19, his parents sent him to Manila to become a merchant. He did that for a while, then left that too. And he found the San Francisco convent, which is where the Franciscan headquarters for their efforts in the Philippines. And this time it's stuck. The only reason he's on that ship is because there was no bishop to ordain him in Manila. So he was going back to Mexico to get ordained. The only reason he's in that house is because Bautista said, if you remember, the Bishop of Japan was coming to kill him, he was Hideyoshi. So Bautista, the head of the Franciscans, was, come up here, we're going to try to get you in, we know you want to be ordained. And so because he wanted just to be ordained as a priest, he was in that house. And of the church across the street from the museum, it is dedicated to 26 martyrs. but it is called St. Philip Church. And there's a statue of Felipe de Jesus on the right as you enter. Close with this. Pope John Paul II visited Nishizaki Hill in February of 1981. I thank God for the lives of all those, wherever they may be, who suffer for their faith in God, for their allegiance to Christ the Savior, for their fidelity to the church. Thank you very much.